Sarah Martinez walked through the iron gates of Westwood Community Center, with her worn canvas bag clutched tightly against her chest. The autumn wind pulled at her faded blue jacket, the one she had owned for nearly 8 years now. Her shoes, though clean, showed signs of repair work done by her own hands. She worked as a cleaner at 3 different office buildings, moving from one location to another throughout the day and often into the night. The community center had recently opened its doors to offer free classes to neighborhood residents. Sarah had seen the flyer taped to the window of the grocery store where she bought her weekly supplies. Among the various offerings, one class caught her attention immediately: piano lessons for beginners. Her heart had skipped a beat when she read those words. She arrived 15 minutes early, not wanting to miss a single moment. The music room was located on the 2nd floor, and she climbed the stairs slowly, listening to the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Through the small window in the door, she could see a beautiful grand piano sitting in the center of the room. Its black surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Sarah pressed her palm against the door, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingers. Other students began to arrive. They came in groups, laughing and chatting with each other. Most of them were younger, dressed in clothes that looked new and expensive. They carried leather bags and held smartphones in their hands. Sarah noticed how they glanced at her briefly before looking away. She was used to this. In her line of work, she had become invisible to most people. 3 teachers entered the room together. The lead instructor was a tall woman named Victoria Ashford. She wore an elegant black dress and her hair was pulled back into a perfect bun. Her glasses had designer frames, and when she spoke, her voice carried an air of authority. The other 2 teachers, Mr. Chen and Miss Roberts, followed behind her, carrying folders and sheet music. Victoria Ashford surveyed the room with sharp eyes. She began calling out names from her attendance list. When she reached Sarah's name, she paused and looked up. Her eyes traveled from Sarah's worn shoes to her simple clothing. A small frown appeared on her face. The class was instructed to take seats at the various keyboards and practice pianos arranged around the room. The grand piano in the center was clearly meant for demonstrations by the teachers. Sarah found a spot near the back corner, away from the other students. She sat down carefully on the bench and looked at the keys before her. They seemed to glow with possibility. Victoria began the lesson by explaining basic music theory. She talked about notes, scales, and proper hand positioning. Sarah absorbed every word, her eyes following the teacher's movements closely. When Victoria demonstrated a simple scale on the grand piano, Sarah's fingers twitched slightly, as if they wanted to mirror the movements. After the demonstration, students were asked to practice the scale on their instruments. The room filled with the hesitant, clumsy sounds of beginners trying to coordinate their fingers. Some students laughed at their mistakes. Others grew frustrated quickly. Sarah placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The sound that came from her keyboard was different. Each note was clear and precise. Her fingers moved with surprising confidence, completing the scale smoothly. She did it again, this time a little faster. The muscle memory was still there, buried deep but not forgotten. Victoria's head turned sharply toward the back corner. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Mr. Chen and Miss Roberts also looked in Sarah's direction. The other students gradually stopped playing, noticing the teacher's reaction. Victoria walked slowly toward Sarah's keyboard. Her heels clicked against the floor with each step. When she reached Sarah, she stood there for a moment, her arms crossed over her chest. Sarah's hands froze above the keys. She looked up at the teacher, uncertain what she had done wrong. The teacher's expression was cold and suspicious. She leaned down slightly, examining Sarah's hands. They were hands that showed hard work, with calluses and rough skin from years of manual labor. They did not look like the hands of someone who should be able to play piano with such ease. Victoria straightened up and returned to the front of the room without saying a word to Sarah. But her eyes kept drifting back to that corner throughout the remainder of the class. When she gave instructions for the next exercise, her voice seemed sharper than before. Some of the other students began whispering to each other, stealing glances at Sarah. Sarah tried to focus on the lesson, but she could feel the weight of judgment settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had hoped this class would be different, a place where only the music mattered, but she recognized this feeling. It was the same feeling she got when wealthy clients at her cleaning jobs watched her suspiciously, as if assuming she might steal something. As the class continued, Victoria assigned a simple melody for students to learn. It was a basic piece meant to teach rhythm and note reading. Sarah looked at the sheet music and something inside her stirred. The notes on the page seemed to speak to her in a language she had once known fluently. Without thinking, her fingers found their positions and she began to play. The melody flowed from her keyboard with unexpected beauty. While other students struggled to hit the right notes at the right time, Sarah played the piece almost perfectly on her first attempt. She added small touches of expression, gentle dynamics that brought the simple melody to life. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward her. Victoria's face flushed red. She marched over to Sarah's keyboard and placed her hand firmly on the music stand, causing it to rattle slightly. The sudden movement made Sarah jump back on her bench. This time, Victoria did speak. Her voice was sharp and accusing, carrying across the quiet room so everyone could hear. She demanded to know if Sarah had lied on her registration form. Had she claimed to be a beginner when she clearly had previous training? Was she making a mockery of the class? Sarah's throat tightened. She tried to explain in her quiet voice that she had not played in many years, that she had almost forgotten everything. But Victoria cut her off. The teacher's words grew harsher. She suggested that Sarah was trying to show off, to make the other students feel inadequate. She questioned whether Sarah had come to the class with dishonest intentions. The other students watched in uncomfortable silence. Some looked sympathetic, but no one spoke up. Mr. Chen and Miss Roberts exchanged glances but said nothing to defend Sarah or question Victoria's harsh treatment. Sarah felt her eyes beginning to burn with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago not to cry in front of people who had already decided what to think of her. She kept her gaze down, staring at the black and white keys that suddenly looked blurry. Sarah returned home that evening to her small studio apartment on the 4th floor of an old building. The elevator had been broken for months, so she climbed the stairs slowly, her legs aching from the long day. She unlocked 3 different locks on her door, a necessity in this neighborhood, and stepped inside. The apartment was tiny but clean. She kept everything organized and tidy, a habit from her work. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a kitchenette barely large enough for one person filled the corner. But it was hers, and she paid for it with her own hard work. Sarah dropped her canvas bag on the table and moved to the window. Outside, the city lights were beginning to flicker on as darkness settled over the streets. She could hear the sounds of neighbors through the thin walls, television programs and conversations in different languages. This building housed people like her, people who worked long hours for little pay, people who remained invisible to much of the world. She made herself a simple dinner of rice and vegetables, eating slowly while her mind replayed the humiliation from the class. Victoria's accusations had stung deeply, not because they were true, but because they revealed how quickly people assumed the worst about someone like her. She had encountered this prejudice before, but it never stopped hurting. After washing her single plate and cup, Sarah pulled a cardboard box from under her bed. Dust covered its surface, and the tape holding it closed had yellowed with age. She had not opened this box in 15 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and lifted the flaps. Inside lay the fragments of her past life. There were old photographs, their colors faded but images still clear. A younger Sarah smiled from these pictures, a girl of 7 or 8 sitting at a piano much larger than herself. In another photo, she stood on a stage holding a trophy nearly as tall as she was. Her mother stood beside her in that picture, pride radiating from her smile. Sarah lifted out a stack of certificates and medals, each one representing a competition won, a milestone achieved. State junior piano champion at age 9, regional competition first place at age 11, scholarship recipient to the prestigious Riverside Music Academy at age 12. The papers felt fragile in her hands, as if they might crumble into dust. Beneath the awards lay newspaper clippings. Local papers had written about her, calling her a prodigy, a young talent destined for greatness. One headline read, "Young Martinez stuns audience with Rachmaninoff performance." Another proclaimed, "Child piano genius headed for bright future." She barely recognized herself in these stories. That girl seemed like someone else entirely. At the bottom of the box was a program from her last public performance. It had taken place at the city's main concert hall when she was 14 years old. She had played Chopin, Beethoven, and Liszt that evening, The review had praised her technical brilliance and emotional depth. Critics had written that she played with the maturity of someone 3 times her age. Sarah set the program down and closed her eyes. She could still remember that night. The weight of the gown she wore, the heat of the stage lights, the perfect acoustics of the hall that made every note ring with crystal clarity. She remembered her mother sitting in the front row, tears streaming down her face with joy and pride. 3 months after that concert, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. The medical bills began immediately. Insurance covered some costs, but not enough. Never enough. Sarah's father had left when she was a baby. Her mother had raised her alone, working 2 jobs while somehow still finding time to drive Sarah to lessons and practice sessions and competitions. As her mother's condition worsened, choices had to be made. The scholarship to Riverside Academy could not cover living expenses or the special equipment her mother needed. Sarah was 15 when she made her decision. She withdrew from the academy, sold her piano, and took her first job cleaning offices at night. During the day, she cared for her mother. Her mother had begged her not to sacrifice her gift, her future. But Sarah could not make music while her mother suffered. The choice was simple, even if it broke both their hearts. For 3 years, Sarah worked and provided care, watching her mother fade slowly despite every effort, every prayer, every moment of desperate hope. When her mother finally passed, Sarah was 18 years old. She stood alone at the funeral, understanding that she was now truly on her own in the world. The small amount of money left after final medical bills and funeral expenses was barely enough for first month's rent on the tiny apartment. There was no money to return to music school, no way to reclaim the path she had once been on. Years passed in a blur of work and survival. Sarah took on more cleaning jobs, gradually building a routine that kept her fed and housed. She avoided music when she could. It hurt too much to hear, too much to remember. She walked past music stores without looking in their windows. When she heard someone practicing piano through an open window, she quickened her pace. But music is not something that can be completely shut away when it has lived in your bones since childhood. Sometimes Sarah would wake from dreams where her fingers were flying across keys, playing pieces she had not thought about in years. Sometimes at work, while scrubbing floors in empty offices, she would find her hand tapping out complex rhythms on the bucket handle. The community center flyer had awakened something she thought she had buried forever. Part of her knew it was foolish to go back to music, even just for a beginner class. What was the point? She could never reclaim what she had lost. The world of concert halls and competitions and recognition was as far from her current life as the moon. But another part of her, a part she thought had died with her mother, whispered that music was not about awards or fame or recognition. It was about the conversation between soul and sound, the way a melody could express what words never could, the transcendent moment when technique disappeared and only pure feeling remained. She had told herself she would go to the class and stay quiet, blend in, simply enjoy touching piano keys again without drawing attention. She had not intended to reveal any skill, but her fingers betrayed her. When they touched those keys, 15 years of silence vanished. The muscle memory, the understanding, the gift that had been praised and celebrated in her childhood. All of it came flooding back as if no time had passed at all. Now she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence of who she once was, facing the reality of who she had become. Victoria's harsh words echoed in her mind. The teacher's suspicion and hostility had made something clear. People would not accept her as both things, both the cleaning woman and the musician. They would see only contradiction, only dishonesty, only someone trying to be something they were not. Sarah carefully placed everything back in the box. She folded the flaps closed but did not tape them. She slid the box back under her bed, but this time it felt different. The memories were no longer sealed away. They were present, alive, demanding to be acknowledged. She lay down on her bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she had to be at her first cleaning job by 6 in the morning. She needed sleep, but her mind would not rest. It kept showing her images of the grand piano at the community center, kept replaying the feel of the keys under her fingers, kept reminding her of what it felt like to create beauty from silence. The next week arrived faster than Sarah expected. She had debated with herself every day about whether to return to the community center. Pride told her to stay away to avoid further humiliation, but something stronger than pride pulled her back. It was the same force that had driven her to practice for hours as a child, the same passion that had sustained her through difficult pieces and demanding competitions. Music was not something she could simply walk away from, not again. She entered the community center with her head held a little higher this time. She had made a decision during the week. She would not hide her ability, but neither would she apologize for it. If Victoria had a problem with her presence, that was Victoria's burden to carry, not hers. The music room was already filling with students when Sarah arrived. She noticed some of them whispering and looking in her direction. Word had clearly spread about what happened in the previous class. Sarah walked to the same keyboard in the back corner and sat down. She placed her hands in her lap and waited quietly for the class to begin. Victoria entered with her usual air of authority, flanked again by Mr. Chen and Miss Roberts. The lead teacher's eyes immediately found Sarah in the back corner. For a moment, their gazes locked. Victoria's expression hardened, and she turned away sharply to begin the lesson. Today's class focused on hand independence, the ability to make each hand play different rhythms and melodies simultaneously. This was a challenge for beginners, requiring concentration and coordination that only came with practice. Victoria demonstrated on the grand piano, her left hand playing a steady bass pattern while her right hand picked out a simple melody. The students began their attempts. The room filled with discordant sounds as people struggled to make their hands work independently. Fingers stumbled over keys. Rhythms fell apart. Frustration mounted quickly. This was significantly harder than the previous week's lesson. Sarah began the exercise. Her hands moved with separate awareness, each one following its own path while somehow remaining perfectly coordinated with the other. The left hand provided a solid foundation while the right hand sang out the melody. It was not perfect, she was rusty after so many years, but it was far beyond what any true beginner could produce. Victoria stopped her own playing. The sharpness returned to her voice as she called across the room. She demanded that Sarah stop immediately. The entire class fell silent, all eyes turning to watch what would happen next. The teacher marched over to Sarah's keyboard, her face flushed with anger. She accused Sarah again of making a mockery of the class. How dare she continue to come here and show off while other students struggled? This was a class for beginners, for people genuinely trying to learn, not for someone who clearly already knew how to play. Sarah felt something shift inside her. All week she had cleaned other people's messes, scrubbed their toilets, emptied their trash bins, and accepted their barely noticed thank yous, or more often their complete disregard. She had remained silent and small and invisible because that was what her position required. But here at this piano she was not a cleaning woman. Here she was a musician, and musicians spoke through their art. She looked up at Victoria and spoke in a steady voice. She told the teacher that she had not played piano in 15 years. That she had given up music to care for her dying mother, that she had worked 3 jobs just to survive, that this class was her attempt to reconnect with the only thing in her life that had ever made her feel truly alive. Victoria's expression did not soften. Instead, she scoffed at Sarah's explanation. She said that if Sarah had really been as skilled as she claimed, she would not be here in a free community class. Real musicians found ways to continue their careers. Real dedication did not simply disappear because life became difficult. The words struck Sarah like physical blows. They revealed a fundamental lack of understanding about what it meant to live without money, without support, without options. Victoria had likely never had to choose between pursuing her passion and keeping a roof over her head. She had never held her mother's hand during chemotherapy, while simultaneously worrying about next month's rent. Mr. Chen shifted uncomfortably at the front of the room. He cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps they should all take a short break. Miss Roberts nodded in agreement, her face showing distress at the confrontation. But Victoria ignored them both. She was not finished. The lead teacher announced to the entire class that she had reviewed the registration forms. Sarah had marked herself as a complete beginner with no prior experience. This was clearly false information. Victoria stated that she had grounds to remove Sarah from the class for providing dishonest registration details. Sarah stood up from her bench. She was tired, so deeply tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of other people's assumptions and judgments. She gathered her canvas bag and prepared to leave. She had tried. She had reached for this small piece of joy, and once again life had pushed her back down. But as she walked toward the door, one of the other students spoke up. Her name was Jennifer, a young woman probably in her 20s with kind eyes and an uncertain voice. Jennifer said she did not think Sarah should have to leave. That maybe Sarah had made a mistake on the form, but that did not mean she had ill intentions. That it was actually inspiring to see someone play so beautifully. Another student, an older man named George, added his voice. He said he had seen real showing off before, and this was not it. Sarah had been quiet and had kept to herself. She had not mocked anyone's struggles or made them feel bad about their beginner mistakes. Victoria's face grew even redder. She stated firmly that she was the instructor, and she made the decisions about who stayed and who left. This was not a democracy. She pointed at the door and told Sarah to leave immediately. Sarah had reached the doorway when Mr. Chen finally found his voice. The assistant teacher said with obvious nervousness that perhaps they were being too hasty. That if Sarah truly had not played in 15 years, then technically she was relearning, which was similar to beginning. That maybe they could find a solution that allowed everyone to continue. Victoria whirled on Mr. Chen with fury in her eyes. She told him he was undermining her authority in front of the students, that he had no right to question her judgment. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Several students looked down at their hands, desperate to be anywhere but in the middle of this conflict. Miss Roberts, who had been silent throughout, surprised everyone by speaking up. Her voice was soft but clear. She said that she had noticed something about Sarah's playing. It was not just technically proficient. It had feeling, genuine emotion that could not be faked or learned from a YouTube video. That kind of playing came from years of dedication and deep connection to music. She suggested, carefully choosing her words, that perhaps they had a unique opportunity in this class. Perhaps Sarah could help demonstrate concepts, could show the other students what they were working toward. Not to discourage them, but to inspire them. Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times. She appeared momentarily speechless, caught between her anger and the reasonable suggestion from her colleague. The students watched, hardly daring to breathe. The moment stretched on, tense and uncertain. Sarah remained in the doorway, her hand on the frame, caught between leaving and staying. Everything hung in balance, waiting for someone to tip the scales one way or another. Finally, Victoria took a deep breath. She did not apologize. Her pride would not allow that. But she told Sarah in a voice still cold and unwelcoming that she could stay for today's class. They would discuss the situation further afterward and determine whether alternative arrangements needed to be made. Sarah slowly walked back to her keyboard. The victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow. She had not wanted to cause division or conflict. She had simply wanted to play piano, to reconnect with a part of herself that had been buried for too long. The rest of the class proceeded in uncomfortable tension. Victoria's instructions were clipped and brief. She avoided looking in Sarah's direction. Some students smiled at Sarah encouragingly. Others seemed uncertain about what had just happened. The music that filled the room was hesitant and awkward, reflecting the emotional atmosphere. After class ended, Victoria curtly informed Sarah to wait while the other students left. Sarah sat at her keyboard watching as people filed out. Jennifer gave her an encouraging smile on the way out. George nodded in her direction. Most others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the drama they had witnessed. Once the room emptied, Victoria, Mr. Chen, and Miss Roberts formed a small group near the grand piano. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing toward Sarah. She could not hear their words, but their body language told a story. Victoria's gestures were sharp and emphatic. Mr. Chen appeared to be trying to calm the situation. Miss Roberts listened more than she spoke. Finally, they approached Sarah together. Victoria stood slightly ahead of the other two, her posture rigid. She announced that they had reached a decision. Starting next week, Sarah would be moved to an advanced class that met on a different day and time. This way, she would receive instruction appropriate to her skill level and would not disrupt the beginner class. Sarah's heart sank. The advanced class met on Wednesday evenings. That was when she worked her longest shift, cleaning a corporate office building downtown. She needed that job. It paid slightly better than her other positions because of the late hours. She could not simply give it up. She explained this to the teachers, keeping her voice steady despite the disappointment flooding through her. She told them that her work schedule was fixed, that she could not attend on Wednesday evenings, that this Monday class was the only one that fit her schedule. Victoria's expression showed no sympathy. She stated that sometimes people had to make choices about priorities. If Sarah truly wanted to pursue music seriously, she would find a way to rearrange her work schedule. Otherwise, perhaps this was not the right program for her. The assumption embedded in those words cut deep. Make choices about priorities, as if Sarah had not already made the most painful choices imaginable. As if giving up her entire musical career to care for her dying mother had not been prioritizing. As if working herself to exhaustion every single day just to survive was not a form of dedication that Victoria could never understand. Mr. Chen spoke up, suggesting perhaps there was some flexibility. Could Sarah attend part of the beginner class and part of the advanced class? Could they offer her private instruction time that worked with her schedule? He seemed genuinely troubled by the situation. Victoria shut down these suggestions immediately. The community center had limited resources. They could not create special arrangements for one person. She stated again that Sarah needed to either attend the advanced class or discontinue her participation in the program entirely. Sarah stood up slowly. She thanked them for their time and began gathering her things. There was nothing more to discuss. She would not be able to continue with the classes. Another door closing, another path blocked. She had grown accustomed to this pattern in her life. As she walked toward the exit, Miss Roberts suddenly called out. She asked Sarah to wait just one more moment. The young teacher had an idea she wanted to discuss with her colleagues. Victoria sighed with obvious irritation but allowed Miss Roberts to speak. Miss Roberts proposed something different. What if Sarah came to the community center on Saturday mornings? The facility was open then, and the music room was usually empty. Sarah could practice on her own during that time. It would not be a formal class, so there would be no conflict with the beginner students. No instructors needed to be present. Victoria immediately objected. The community center's instruments were not intended for open practice. They were for classes only. Allowing unrestricted access would set a problematic precedent. What if the instruments were damaged? What if other people requested similar arrangements? But Mr. Chen supported Miss Roberts' suggestion. He pointed out that the room truly did sit empty most Saturday mornings. That allowing it to be used seemed like good stewardship of resources. That the instruments needed to be played regularly anyway to stay in good condition. The debate continued for several minutes. Sarah stood silently, not allowing herself to hope, not allowing herself to feel anything yet. She had learned not to count on opportunities until they were absolutely certain. Finally, with obvious reluctance, Victoria agreed to a trial period. Sarah could use the music room on Saturday mornings for 4 weeks. If there were any problems, any damage, any complaints, the arrangement would end immediately. And this was a special exception, not to be discussed with other students or presented as standard policy. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Saturday mornings. She could do Saturday mornings. She would be tired from working late Friday nights, but she could do it. She thanked all 3 teachers, especially Miss Roberts, and left before Victoria could change her mind. That Saturday morning, Sarah arrived at the community center at dawn. The building was quiet, with only a janitor mopping floors in the lobby. He barely glanced at her as she climbed the stairs to the music room. She unlocked the door with the key Miss Roberts had given her, stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, waiting. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, creating patterns on its glossy black surface. Sarah approached it slowly, almost reverently. This was not a practice keyboard in the back corner. This was a real piano, a beautiful instrument that deserved to be played by someone who understood its worth. She sat on the bench and lifted the fallboard, exposing the keys. She placed her hands in position, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips, and then she began to play. The first piece she chose was Mozart's Piano Sonata in C major. It was one of the first advanced pieces she had learned as a child. Her fingers remembered the patterns, the runs, the delicate ornaments. The music flowed out, filling the empty room with crystalline beauty. She was rusty. There were moments when her fingers stumbled, when the timing was not quite right, when the dynamics were rougher than they should be. But underneath the imperfections, the foundation was solid. The years of rigorous training, the countless hours of practice, the muscle memory built during her childhood, all of it was still there. Sarah played for 2 hours straight. She moved through pieces from her past, rediscovering them like meeting old friends after a long separation. Bach's Prelude in C major, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Each piece brought back memories not just of the notes but of where she had been when she learned them. What had been happening in her life, how the music had made her feel. She also discovered that her hands were no longer a child's hands. They were stronger now from years of physical labor. The calluses that Victoria had looked at with such suspicion actually helped her fingers press the keys with surety and control. The rough life she had lived had changed her playing in ways that were not all negative. When she finally stopped, her arms ached pleasantly. She felt energized rather than tired. Despite the early hour and the hard week of work she had just completed, playing music was like breathing fresh air after being in a stuffy room for years. It awakened parts of her that had been dormant, parts of her she had thought were dead. Sarah returned the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Each week she arrived at dawn and played until mid-morning. She worked through scales and exercises to rebuild her technique. She challenged herself with pieces she had never learned before, struggling through the difficult passages until they began to smooth out. The janitor, whose name she learned was Marcus, sometimes stopped his cleaning to listen outside the door. One morning he came in during her break and told her that her music made his work easier, that it was nice to hear something beautiful in a building that was usually empty and silent on weekends. Sarah smiled at his kindness, grateful for the appreciation that came without judgment or complication. On the fourth Saturday, Sarah arrived to find that she was not alone. Miss Roberts was sitting in the room waiting for her. Sarah's first thought was that the trial period was over, that Victoria had decided to end the arrangement. She braced herself for disappointment, but Miss Roberts was smiling. She explained that she had come to listen, that Mr. Chen had told her how much progress Sarah was making, which he had heard from Marcus, that she was curious to hear someone play who had once been considered a prodigy. Sarah felt suddenly shy. Playing alone in an empty room was one thing. Performing for an audience, even an audience of one, brought back old anxieties. The pressure to be perfect, to meet expectations, to prove herself worthy. But Miss Roberts looked at her with such genuine interest and kindness that Sarah found herself agreeing. She chose to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was a piece that had always moved her deeply, one that required both technical skill and emotional understanding. She began slowly, letting the opening notes shimmer in the quiet room. As she played, she forgot about Miss Roberts watching. She forgot about Victoria's hostility and the years of lost opportunities. She forgot about everything except the conversation between her fingers and the keys, the story being told through sound. When the last notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, Sarah kept her hands resting on the keys. She was afraid to look up, afraid to see disappointment or pity or worse, the kind of false praise that people gave to make someone feel better about mediocre performance. But when she finally turned toward Miss Roberts, the young teacher's eyes were bright with tears. Miss Roberts stood up and walked closer to the piano. She told Sarah that in all her years of teaching and studying music, she had rarely heard someone play with such genuine feeling. The technical skill was impressive, yes, but it was the emotion in the playing that truly stood out. She asked Sarah about her background. Not in the suspicious, accusatory way Victoria had, but with real interest and compassion. Sarah found herself telling her story, the whole story, about being discovered as a gifted child, about the competitions and the scholarships and the predicted brilliant future, about her mother's illness and the impossible choice between music and family, about the 15 years of silence and work and survival. Miss Roberts listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When Sarah finished, the teacher sat quietly for a moment before speaking. She said something that surprised Sarah. She apologized, not just for herself, but for Victoria, for the assumptions that had been made, for the judgment that had been passed on someone whose life they did not understand. She told Sarah that she had grown up with privilege. Music lessons had been provided by her parents without financial strain. She had attended prestigious schools and had never had to choose between her passion and her survival. Meeting Sarah had opened her eyes to how differently people experienced the world. The conversation shifted to what came next. Miss Roberts asked Sarah what she wanted from music now. Was she hoping to return to professional performance? Did she want to teach? Or was this simply about personal fulfillment? Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth was, she did not know. The dream of being a concert pianist felt like something from another lifetime, something that belonged to that young girl in the photographs, not to the tired woman sitting at this piano. But she also knew that playing music had awakened something essential in her. It had reminded her that she was more than her work, more than her circumstances, more than what others saw when they looked at her. She told Miss Roberts that she simply wanted to continue playing, that these Saturday mornings had become the highlight of her week, that she did not need fame or recognition or a career. She just needed this, the private conversation with music, the joy of creating beauty for its own sake. Miss Roberts nodded thoughtfully. Then she made a suggestion. The community center was hosting a recital in 2 months. It was a showcase for students from all the various classes, a way to demonstrate what the programs were accomplishing. Would Sarah consider performing? Sarah's immediate reaction was fear. Performing publicly meant exposure, meant opening herself up to judgment and criticism. It meant standing on a stage where people could see her worn clothes and rough hands and make their assumptions. It meant risking humiliation on a much larger scale than what had happened in the beginner class. But Miss Roberts pressed gently. She said that Sarah's story needed to be heard, that there were probably many people in the community who had given up on dreams for practical reasons, who had let their talents fade because survival took priority. Seeing Sarah perform might inspire them, might remind them that it was never too late to reconnect with what made them feel alive. Sarah said she would think about it. She could not make a promise she was not sure she could keep. The fear was real and powerful, but so was the small voice inside her that whispered yes, that wanted to stand on that stage and show the world what she could do. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her Saturday morning practice sessions. She also started coming early on Monday mornings before the community center officially opened, getting permission from Marcus to let her in. She was preparing, though she had not yet told Miss Roberts that she had decided to perform. She needed to be sure first, needed to believe she could do it. She chose her pieces carefully, Bach's Prelude and Fugue in C major for its mathematical beauty and complexity, Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor for its emotional depth and dramatic range, and Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, the Moonlight Sonata, because it was the piece she had been learning when her mother first became ill, the piece that held her last memories of playing before everything changed. The practice was grueling. Her hands ached from the combination of her work and the intensive playing. She developed blisters that she had to bandage carefully so they would not interfere with her cleaning jobs. Some mornings she was so tired that the notes swam before her eyes, but she pushed through, driven by something stronger than exhaustion. Victoria remained cold and distant during the Monday beginner classes, which Sarah occasionally observed from the doorway while waiting for her practice time to begin. The lead teacher had clearly not forgiven Sarah for disrupting her class or for the way Mr. Chen and Miss Roberts had advocated for her. But Victoria also did not try to revoke the practice privileges. Perhaps she knew it would make her look petty. Or perhaps, on some level, even she recognized that Sarah deserved this chance. 6 weeks before the recital, something unexpected happened. Sarah arrived for her Saturday morning session to find the music room occupied. A man in his 60s sat at the grand piano playing through what sounded like student compositions. He looked up when she entered and his face registered surprise. He introduced himself as Dr. Richard Chen, Mr. Chen's father and a retired professor of music from the State University. He apologized for taking her practice time. His son had mentioned that a remarkably talented woman used the room on Saturday mornings, and he had been curious to meet her. He hoped she would not mind if he stayed to listen for a bit. Sarah's instinct was to refuse. She did not perform well under observation by experts. Their trained ears could hear every flaw, every imperfection, every place where her technique had degraded over the years. But there was something warm and non-threatening about Dr. Chen's demeanor. He did not carry the judgment that Victoria had, or even the slightly pitying kindness that others sometimes showed. He simply seemed genuinely interested, she agreed, and began her practice session with scales and exercises, warming up her fingers and settling her nerves. Dr. Chen listened quietly, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of approval. When she moved into her recital pieces, he closed his eyes and listened with complete focus. After she finished the Bach, he opened his eyes and asked if he could offer some observations. Sarah tensed, preparing for criticism. But Dr. Chen's comments were insightful rather than critical. He pointed out places where slight adjustments in fingering would make difficult passages easier. He suggested different approaches to dynamics that would highlight the architecture of the piece more clearly. He asked questions about why she made certain interpretive choices, treating her like a colleague rather than a student. They spent 2 hours working together, and it felt like the best lesson Sarah had ever received. Dr. Chen had a gift for teaching that went beyond technical instruction. He helped her understand the composer's intentions, the historical context of the pieces, the emotional journey each work was meant to create. He treated her abilities with respect while gently pushing her to reach higher. As their session ended, Dr. Chen made an offer. He would like to coach her for the recital if she was willing. No charge, simply for the pleasure of working with someone who had such natural musicality. He had nothing but free time in his retirement, and he missed working with serious students. Sarah could barely believe what she was hearing. Private coaching from a professor? This was an opportunity that would have cost thousands of dollars if she were paying for it. She accepted immediately, and they arranged to meet every Saturday morning. Dr. Chen proved to be exactly the mentor she needed. He was patient with her limitations while believing absolutely in her capabilities. He shared stories from his years of teaching and performing, treating her as an equal despite the vast difference in their current circumstances. Through Dr. Chen, Sarah learned that Mr. Chen had been talking about her to his father for weeks. The younger Chen had been troubled by Victoria's treatment of Sarah and impressed by her determination to continue despite the obstacles. He had hoped his father might be able to help in some way. The recital date approached steadily. Sarah felt her confidence growing, though the fear never completely disappeared. She practiced her 3 pieces until she could play them in her sleep. Dr. Chen helped her work through not just the notes, but the performance aspects: how to walk on stage, how to acknowledge the audience, how to handle the inevitable nervousness. 2 weeks before the recital, Miss Roberts approached Sarah with news. The local newspaper wanted to do a story about the community center's programs. They were particularly interested in featuring students with interesting backgrounds. Miss Roberts had suggested Sarah's story. Would she be willing to be interviewed? Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. The last thing she wanted was public attention that might invite more judgment or skepticism. But Miss Roberts explained that the article could help the community center secure more funding for its programs, that it could show people what these free classes meant to those who needed them most. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed to the interview. The reporter, a young woman named Amanda, met her at a coffee shop near Sarah's apartment. Sarah told her story simply and honestly, leaving out nothing. She talked about her childhood achievements, her mother's illness, the sacrifice she had made, and the 15 years of silence. She talked about returning to music at the community center and about preparing for the recital. Amanda listened with increasing fascination. She asked if she could attend the recital to photograph Sarah's performance. She promised the article would be respectful and would focus on Sarah's love of music rather than sensationalizing her circumstances. Sarah gave her permission, though the thought of being photographed made her uncomfortable. The article was published 3 days before the recital. It ran on the front page of the local section with the headline, "The Cleaning Woman Who Was a Prodigy." The article told Sarah's story with sensitivity and respect, including quotes from Dr. Chen about her extraordinary talent and from Miss Roberts about her dedication. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The community center's phone began ringing with people asking about the recital. The event, which had been expected to draw maybe 30 or 40 people, suddenly needed a larger venue. The center's director arranged to use the auditorium at a nearby high school to accommodate the growing interest. Sarah felt panic rising as the scale of the event expanded. This was supposed to be a small performance, a private reclaiming of her identity as a musician. Now it was becoming a public spectacle. What if she failed? What if her performance did not live up to the story the newspaper had told? What if people came expecting the prodigy from the photographs and saw only a middle-aged cleaning woman who could no longer play at that level? Dr. Chen calmed her fears during their final practice session. He reminded her that music was not a competition or a test. It was communication. All she needed to do was communicate honestly, to share the beauty she heard in these pieces, to play from her heart. The audience would respond to that authenticity, regardless of whether every note was technically perfect. The night before the recital, Sarah barely slept. She lay in her small apartment, listening to the sounds of the city, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. She thought about her mother, who had believed so completely in her gift. She thought about the young girl she had been, fearless and full of dreams. She thought about the path her life had taken, so different from what anyone had predicted. The day of the recital arrived with bright sunshine that felt almost mocking to Sarah's nervous state. She went through her morning routine mechanically, showering, choosing the one nice dress she owned, a simple black dress her mother had bought her for performances years ago. It still fit, though it was worn at the edges and outdated in style. She arrived at the high school auditorium 3 hours early. Dr. Chen met her there, along with Miss Roberts. They walked her through the space, showing her where she would wait backstage, how she would enter, where the piano was positioned. The grand piano from the community center had been moved to the stage, looking magnificent under the stage lights. Sarah sat at the piano and played through sections of her pieces, getting familiar with the acoustics of the larger space. The auditorium was beautiful with excellent sound quality. Her notes rang out clearly, filling the empty seats with music. Dr. Chen listened carefully and made a few small suggestions about adjusting to the room's characteristics. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah watched through a gap in the curtain as people began to arrive. The auditorium filled steadily. She saw faces from the community center, students from the Monday class, including Jennifer and George. She saw Marcus, the janitor who had listened to her practice. She saw people she did not recognize, strangers who had come because of the newspaper article. And then she saw Victoria Ashford enter, accompanied by several well-dressed people, who appeared to be colleagues or administrators. Victoria's face was difficult to read from a distance, but her presence sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Sarah's body. The teacher who had humiliated her, who had questioned her honesty and motives, would be sitting in the audience watching her perform. Miss Roberts noticed Sarah's reaction and came to stand beside her. The young teacher placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder and reminded her that this performance was not about Victoria or anyone else's judgment. It was about Sarah's relationship with music, about reclaiming something precious that had been lost. No one in that audience could take that away from her unless she let them. The recital began with performances by other students from various programs. A violinist played a simple folk melody. A young boy struggled bravely through a beginning piano piece. A guitar student performed a Spanish composition with impressive skill. The audience was warm and encouraging, applauding each performer with genuine appreciation. Sarah waited backstage, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her hands felt cold and slightly numb. The old performance anxiety that she had not felt in 15 years came flooding back, but now it was mixed with a different kind of fear. The fear of being seen, of being visible, of being vulnerable in front of hundreds of people. Then Miss Roberts was speaking into the microphone, introducing her. She told Sarah's story briefly but powerfully, speaking about dedication and sacrifice and the universal human need to express ourselves through art. The audience fell silent, listening intently. Sarah walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, making it hard to see individual faces in the audience. She sat at the piano bench and adjusted her position, going through the small rituals that performers use to center themselves. She placed her hands on her lap and took 3 deep breaths, just as Dr. Chen had taught her. Then she lifted her hands and began to play Bach. The first notes emerged clear and strong. Her fingers found their positions as if guided by muscle memory, older than conscious thought. The prelude unfolded with mathematical precision, each voice entering at exactly the right moment, weaving together into the complex tapestry Bach had designed. The fugue followed, building in intensity. The subject passed from hand to hand, transforming and developing. As she played, something remarkable happened. The fear began to dissolve. The audience faded from her awareness. Even the pressure of the performance lifted. She was simply playing music, engaged in that ancient conversation between heart and sound. This was what she had missed during all those years of silence. Not the applause or recognition, but this, the pure act of creation. The Bach ended and the audience burst into applause. Sarah allowed herself a small smile, acknowledging their appreciation before moving into the Chopin. This piece required a different approach, more romantic and emotional. She let herself feel the melancholy beauty of the ballade, its dramatic shifts from gentle melody to powerful outbursts. Her years of hardship informed her interpretation. She understood sadness and struggle in ways she had not as a privileged child. That understanding flowed through her fingers into the music. When the Chopin finished, the applause was louder, more enthusiastic. Sarah could hear individual voices calling out encouragement. But she did not pause long. She needed to maintain her focus for the final piece, the Moonlight Sonata. This was the piece that meant the most to her personally. The first movement began with those famous haunting notes that everyone recognized. She played it slowly, letting each note breathe, creating an atmosphere of moonlit solitude. This was the music she had been playing when her world changed forever. Every note carried memory and meaning that went beyond technique. The second movement provided a brief, lighter interlude. Then came the third movement, the dramatic finale that many performers struggled with. It required tremendous technical skill, the notes flying by at incredible speed while maintaining clarity and power. Sarah's fingers, strengthened by years of manual labor, attacked the keys with confident precision. The music built to its explosive conclusion, and she played the final chords with all the emotion she had been holding inside for 15 years. Silence fell over the auditorium for just a moment, that perfect silence that follows a truly moving performance. Then the audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. People were not just clapping politely. They were celebrating, shouting, expressing genuine amazement and appreciation. Sarah stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. Tears ran down her face, but she did not try to hide them. These were tears of release, of joy, of something fundamental being restored to its rightful place in her life. She bowed again and the applause continued. Dr. Chen appeared on stage, something that was not part of the planned program. He took the microphone and asked the audience for their attention. When the applause finally died down, he spoke about what they had just witnessed. He explained that he had worked with countless talented students over his 40-year career, but rarely had he encountered someone with Sarah's combination of technical mastery and emotional depth. He talked about what it meant to sacrifice for family, to put others before self. He spoke about the different kinds of dedication, not just the dedication to art, but the dedication to human connection and responsibility. He said that Sarah's music was profound precisely because it came from someone who had lived fully, who had suffered and endured, who understood what it meant to lose something precious and to find it again. Victoria Ashford sat in the third row, her face pale. The people beside her were whispering animatedly, clearly impressed by the performance. One of them, an older man who appeared to be someone important, leaned over to speak to Victoria. From the stage, Sarah could not hear their conversation, but she could see Victoria nodding, her expression troubled. After the recital ended and the formal program concluded, people crowded around Sarah. They wanted to shake her hand, to tell her how moved they were, to ask about her story. Amanda, the reporter, was there with her camera, documenting everything. Jennifer from the beginner class hugged Sarah tightly and told her she was an inspiration. George pumped her hand enthusiastically and said he would never complain about practice being difficult again. Marcus, the janitor, waited patiently on the edge of the crowd. When he finally reached Sarah, he simply said that he had known all along that something special was happening in that music room on Saturday mornings, that he had felt privileged to hear it, even through a closed door. Dr. Chen stood beside Sarah, beaming with pride as if she were his own daughter. Miss Roberts looked vindicated, her faith in Sarah proven correct in front of everyone. Even Mr. Chen, usually so quiet and reserved, was smiling broadly and accepting congratulations on his role in helping Sarah. Victoria Ashford finally made her way through the crowd. Sarah watched her approach, unsure what to expect. The other conversations around them gradually died down as people sensed the significance of this moment. The teacher who had humiliated Sarah, who had questioned her character and tried to exclude her from the class, now stood face to face with the woman who had just given a performance that left the entire audience breathless. Victoria's face was flushed, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She opened her mouth several times before words finally came out. She told Sarah that the performance was exceptional, that she had clearly misjudged the situation in the beginning, that she had allowed her own assumptions to cloud her professional judgment. It was not quite an apology, but it was the closest Victoria could apparently come to admitting she had been wrong. Sarah recognized the difficulty this represented for someone as proud as Victoria. She accepted the acknowledgement with grace, simply thanking Victoria for coming to the recital. But Victoria was not finished. The older man who had been sitting beside her stepped forward. He introduced himself as Donald Peterson, director of the city's Arts Council and a board member of the community center. He had been astonished by Sarah's performance. He wanted to know if she had considered teaching. The community center desperately needed instructors who could work with advanced students, and her background and obvious skill made her an ideal candidate. Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Teaching? She had never considered it. She was a cleaning woman, not a teacher. She did not have the right credentials or certifications, but Mr. Peterson waved away her concerns. Her performance tonight had been her credential, her story, her dedication, her understanding of music at the highest level. These were what mattered. He offered her a position teaching advanced piano students 2 evenings per week at the community center. The pay would not be substantial, but it would be steady income doing something she loved. She could keep her other jobs if needed, or perhaps gradually transition to teaching full-time if more opportunities arose. Sarah's mind raced. 2 evenings per week teaching music. It would mean giving up 2 of her cleaning shifts, which would reduce her income initially, but it would also mean using her hands to create beauty rather than scrub toilets. It would mean sharing her knowledge with others, helping young musicians develop their gifts. It would mean being valued for her true abilities rather than just her capacity for hard work. She said yes before she could overthink it, before fear and practicality could talk her out of it. Mr. Peterson smiled warmly and promised to have the paperwork ready by the end of the week. Victoria stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but no longer hostile. Perhaps she was learning that talent and dedication could come from unexpected places, could survive in people whose lives had not followed conventional paths. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life began to transform in ways she had not imagined possible. The newspaper article and her recital performance created a ripple effect throughout the community. People who had read about her story reached out with opportunities. A local music store owner offered her a part-time job giving lessons at his shop. A wealthy family whose office building she cleaned recognized her from the article and asked if she would teach their teenage daughter, offering to pay generous rates. Sarah was able to reduce her cleaning work from 3 jobs to just 1, the one that paid best and had the most flexible hours. The rest of her time she devoted to teaching and practicing. She was not wealthy by any means, but for the first time in 15 years, she did not live in constant fear of unexpected expenses. She could pay her rent on time and still have money left over for small comforts. More importantly, she woke up each morning with purpose beyond mere survival. She thought about her students, about what pieces they were learning, about how to help them overcome technical challenges or understand musical concepts more deeply. She practiced regularly, continuing to work with Dr. Chen, who had become not just a mentor but a dear friend. Her teaching style was unique because of her background. She understood what it meant to struggle, to have limited resources, to face obstacles that seemed insurmountable. She never dismissed a student's difficulties or made them feel inadequate. She remembered what Victoria's harsh judgment had felt like, and she was determined to never make her students feel that way. At the same time, she had high standards. She knew what excellence required because she had achieved it herself. She pushed her students to work hard, to practice diligently, to reach beyond what they thought they were capable of. But she did it with encouragement rather than criticism, with belief in their potential rather than doubt. Jennifer from the beginner class became one of her students. The young woman had been inspired by Sarah's story and had asked if Sarah would teach her privately. They worked together twice a week, and Sarah watched with satisfaction as Jennifer's playing improved dramatically under focused instruction. Sarah also volunteered to give free lessons to students who could not afford to pay. The community center provided space for these sessions. She worked with children from low-income families, with elderly people who had always wanted to learn piano but never had the opportunity, with anyone who showed genuine interest and dedication. She remembered being that gifted child who might not have developed her talent without access to instruction, and she wanted to provide that access to others. 6 months after the recital, Sarah was invited to perform at the city's annual arts festival. This was a prestigious event, attended by hundreds of people and covered by media from across the region. She played a program that mixed classical masterworks with contemporary pieces, demonstrating the breadth of her musical understanding. The performance was reviewed in the regional newspaper. The critic praised her technical brilliance but was particularly struck by the emotional authenticity of her playing. The review included a line that Sarah cut out and kept, tucked into her mirror at home. It said, "Martinez plays as someone who has lived, who has suffered, who has persevered. Her music does not merely display skill. It bears witness to the human capacity for resilience and hope." Victoria Ashford attended that festival performance. Afterward, she approached Sarah with something that looked like genuine remorse. She apologized, really apologized this time, for her initial treatment of Sarah. She admitted that she had made assumptions based on appearance and circumstances, rather than taking time to understand the person before her. She said working with Sarah over the past months as a fellow instructor at the community center had taught her important lessons about humility and about recognizing that merit existed in unexpected places. Sarah accepted the apology with warmth. She bore no grudge against Victoria. Everyone carried their own biases and blind spots. What mattered was the willingness to learn, to grow, to admit mistakes and try to do better. Victoria had done that slowly and imperfectly, but she had done it. A year after that first humiliating Monday class, Sarah was invited to give a speech at the community center's annual fundraising gala. She stood before an audience of donors and community leaders and told them what the center had meant to her. Not just as a place to rediscover her musical abilities, but as a place that had reminded her of her own worth as a human being. She talked about how society often judged people by their jobs, their income, their circumstances. How easy it was to look at someone and think you knew their entire story. How damaging those quick judgments could be. How they could close doors and crush spirits and make people doubt their own value. But she also talked about resilience, about the surprising strength of the human spirit, about how gifts buried under years of hardship could resurface when given even the smallest opportunity. About how one person's belief, like Miss Roberts' advocacy or Dr. Chen's mentorship, could change the entire trajectory of a life. She ended her speech by sitting at the piano and playing a short piece she had composed herself. It was the first original composition she had attempted, a musical representation of her journey from prodigy to cleaning woman to teacher. It began with the bright, optimistic themes of childhood moved through darker, more complex passages representing loss and struggle, and concluded with a mature, hard-won piece that integrated both joy and sorrow into something whole. The audience responded with a standing ovation. But for Sarah, the applause was secondary to the satisfaction of having told her story in the language she understood best. The language of music. She continued teaching and performing, building a modest but sustainable career in music. She never became famous in the way people had predicted when she was a child prodigy. Her name did not appear on concert hall marquees in major cities. She did not record albums or tour internationally, but she touched lives every day. Her students went on to win competitions, to earn scholarships, to pursue their own musical dreams. Some of them came from backgrounds similar to her own, and she made sure they knew that obstacles did not have to be permanent barriers. That dedication and love for the craft mattered more than perfect circumstances. Sarah moved into a larger apartment, though still modest by most standards. She bought a used upright piano that fit barely into her living room. It was not a grand piano, not the beautiful instrument she had once owned as a child, but it was hers, bought with money she had earned through music. And every morning before work and every evening after teaching, she played it. Sometimes she played pieces from the classical repertoire, maintaining and expanding her skills. Sometimes she experimented with composition, finding her own musical voice. Sometimes she simply improvised, letting her fingers wander across the keys without plan or purpose, just enjoying the pure act of making sound. She thought often about her mother and wished desperately that she could have been there to see this transformation. But she also felt her mother's presence in the music itself, in the values of dedication and sacrifice and love that had shaped both their lives. Her mother had given up so much to nurture Sarah's gift. Sarah had given up that gift to care for her mother. And now, somehow, through a combination of chance and courage and the kindness of a few key people, she had found her way back to music. The journey had not been simple or straightforward. It had involved humiliation and judgment and countless obstacles. But it had also revealed truths that the young prodigy could never have understood. That music was not about proving superiority or earning praise. It was about expressing what words could not capture, about connecting with others through shared emotion, about finding beauty in a world that often felt harsh and unfair. Sarah Martinez, who had been humiliated by teachers who could not see past their assumptions, who had survived 15 years of silence and hardship, who had returned to music despite every reason to give up, stood as proof that it was never too late to reclaim lost parts of ourselves. That circumstances might force us to set aside our dreams, but those dreams did not die. They waited, patient and persistent for the moment when we were ready to welcome them home.